Reginald Vanderbilt was dead at 45, his liver ruined, his gambling losses a thing he had once dodged a courtroom to avoid confessing out loud. He had been handed $10 million on the morning he came of age, and when the lawyers finally read his will, the strangest line in it was the money that was still there. A whole fortune his own father had locked away where this particular son could never reach it, because the old man had looked at his boy and known exactly what he would do with a free hand. He was not the only heir who set out to spend himself into the ground. One of them shipped a milk cow across the ocean so he need never taste strange milk. One was said to change his clothes 40 times before dinner and called that a life. 3 men, 3 fortunes, not a single dollar of it earned. This is what they did with everything. If the men the Gilded Age handed the world to make your blood run a little hot, subscribe. I go deep into these lives every week, and you will not look at inherited money the same way again. Lazarus Chapter 1. The Sons Who Never Worked a Day. The Gilded Age built fortunes faster than any age in American history, and then it built a creature to waste them. The men who made the money were most of them hard and narrow and relentless. They laid rail across a continent. They wired the oceans. They cornered markets and crushed rivals and rose before dawn for 50 years. And by the end of it, they sat on piles of capital so large that no single human appetite could spend the interest, let alone touch the principal beneath it. And then they died, and the money passed, whole and warm, into the open hands of sons who had never been told no in their lives, who had never earned a dollar, and who were never once expected to. This is a story about 3 of those sons, not the builders, the inheritors, not the men who made the great American fortunes, but the men who were handed them and set about, with real energy and real ingenuity, destroying them. They came from 3 different countries of money. One inherited the most powerful newspaper in America. One inherited a rope manufacturing fortune out of Brooklyn. One inherited the most famous surname in the whole of the United States. 3 separate empires built by 3 hard men and 3 soft sons who took what those men had made and poured it out onto the ground. And all 3 of them arrived at the same place, which was ruin by 3 different roads. And the roads are the entire point of what follows. There is a grim logic underneath it, and the logic repeats itself in family after family, right across the age. The first man is hungry because he has known real want, and hunger is the thing that builds a great fortune in the first place. The second man is careful because he stood at the first man's elbow and watched him build it, and caution is the thing that guards a fortune once it exists. But the third man, and sometimes even the second, is born into a world with no want anywhere in it, no lesson at all in the cost of things, no single morning on which anybody ever troubled to tell him that the money might one day run out, because to him it plainly and obviously never could. He is handed the finished fortune the way another child is handed a toy, and he plays with it exactly the way a child plays with a toy, carelessly, endlessly, until it finally breaks apart in his hands. That is the creature the Gilded Age manufactured almost as a byproduct of its own roaring success, the heir with a giant's purse and an infant sense of what a single dollar is actually worth. The 3 men in this story are only the purest and most spectacular examples of that creature the whole era ever produced, and once you have seen the shape of it in one of them, you will see it running its full course in all 3. Think of an inherited fortune as a meter. It starts running the day the money is handed over, and it runs a little faster every time the heir reaches out his hand and spends. A working fortune, a fortune still tied to a business that earns, refills itself even as the meter turns, so the number on the dial holds steady or climbs. But an idle fortune, a fortune with nobody clever left tending the machine that made it, only ever runs down. The whole of this video is 3 meters running. Watch them turn. Watch how fast the dial spins when the man turning it never once had to learn what any of it cost. And watch, at the close of each life, the final number that gets read aloud in a lawyer's quiet office, because that number is the verdict, and the 3 verdicts, as you will see, are not the same verdict at all. 2 things about that world made the meters run faster than they ever could today, and you need both of them in your hand before we begin. The first is the trust. A shrewd father, a father who looked hard at his son and did not like everything he saw there, could tie the money up in a legal instrument that let the boy spend the income for the whole of his life, but never once lay a finger on the principal itself. It was the single break the age had invented against exactly this kind of heir. And you will watch it save one of these three fortunes at the very last moment, and you will notice, pointedly, that the fathers of the other two never once thought to reach for it. The second thing is simpler still. For most of the years, these men were pouring their inheritances out across card tables and yacht decks and tailors' counters. There was no federal income tax in America worth the name. Nothing skimmed the top. Nothing slowed the drain. A dollar spent was a dollar gone at full speed, and a dollar kept was a dollar untouched by the state. The meters ran clean, and they ran fast. They ran, too, on the grandest stage the country had ever built for the spending of money. This was the age of Mrs. Astor's 400, of the Newport summer season and the Saratoga racing weeks, of the great clubs and the transatlantic circuit of resorts where American society went to display itself and to be seen displaying itself. New money strained against old money for the right to be received in the right drawing rooms. A young heir's whole career could consist of nothing more than being present in exactly the right rooms, dressed exactly right, consuming beautifully, and the culture had a ready-made slang vocabulary for the useless rich young man precisely because it was producing so very many of them. The sport, the dude, the absentee proprietor who ran his affairs from a deck chair an ocean away. These were recognized types, familiar figures, and the three men in this story are simply the three most spectacular examples the age ever produced of each. So, keep the meter turning in your mind and keep the great lit stage standing behind it. And begin with the man who spent the most of the three and lost the very least of himself. Chapter 2. A boy handed a machine he did not build. James Gordon Bennett Jr. inherited the most powerful newspaper in America and treated it like a toy left to him by a stranger. The newspaper was the New York Herald, and it was not a small thing to be handed. His father, James Gordon Bennett Sr., was a Scottish immigrant who had come to the country with almost nothing in his pockets, founded the Herald in 1835, and built it by sheer ferocity and a genius for what ordinary people actually wanted to read over their breakfast, into the most widely read and most profitable newspaper in the United States. He had been a hard and difficult and tireless man, hated by many, feared by more, and he had made the Herald into a genuine power in the land. A paper that could move opinion and topple reputations and set the talk of the whole city each morning. That was a real fortune, made from nothing, by a man who worked himself half to death to make it. It was the perfect model of the whole age. The hard immigrant father, the entire life poured into the machine, the great pile of money and power left standing at the end of it. And then the machine passed to the son, who had inherited every one of the father's advantages, and almost none of the father's discipline. The elder Bennett had raised the boy strangely, at a careful distance from the country he would one day inherit a piece of. He sent him to be educated largely in France, in part because old New York society had never fully accepted the Bennetts at all. The father was a newspaperman, and newspapermen were tradesmen, and tradesmen were not received in the drawing rooms that mattered no matter how much money they piled up, or how much fear they commanded. So the son grew up half in Paris and half rejected at home, carrying inside him a wound about a city he would spend the whole rest of his life both craving and despising in equal measure. That wound is worth holding on to as we go, because a great deal of what he later did, the exile, the contempt, the endless need to dazzle the very society that had once snubbed his family, grew straight up out of it. He came into control of the Herald at 25, in the first days of 1867, and became its sole proprietor when his father died 5 years after that. Here the story has to be fair to him for a moment, because Bennett was not simply a fool who had been left a printing press. He had, when it suited him, a real newspaperman's instinct, and the single best thing his money ever did was pure Bennett from beginning to end. He summoned a young reporter named Henry Morton Stanley and told him to go to Africa and find the missionary and explorer David Livingstone, who had walked off into the deep interior of the continent and simply vanished, and was presumed by a great many people to be long dead. It was an extravagant, almost insane commission, the kind of order only a man with far more money than sense would ever give, and only a great newspaper could pay to carry out. Stanley went, and in 1871, on the shore of a lake in what is now Tanzania, he found the old man alive and greeted him, so the story has always gone, with a line that has never quite left the language since. Dr. Livingstone, I presume. The greeting was very likely polished a little in the retelling, but the feat behind it was entirely real, and it was Bennett's money and Bennett's front page that reached clear across the world and made it happen. It is one of the real puzzles of the man that the same person capable of the Stanley Commission was also capable of everything that came after it. The order that went out to find Livingstone was not luck, and it was not an accident. It took nerve, and it took vision, and it took a genuine understanding of what a newspaper could be and could do out in the world. The sure instinct of a man who might, in some other life, have been the full equal of his hard-driving father. That instinct flickered in Bennett all his days, in sudden bright flashes, and then it went dark again for years at a stretch while he turned back to his boats and his grudges and his own deep comfort. He plainly had the ability somewhere inside him. What he lacked, utterly and from birth, was any need whatsoever to use it, and a great talent with no necessity behind it is a strange and wasteful thing to watch. A fine engine bolted to nothing at all, idling alone in a locked garage. The joke of the whole machine his father built is that the son was never too stupid to run it. He was only ever far too rich to bother. He put his name to other things that would outlast him as well. He poured money into a transatlantic telegraph cable company built alongside a partner named John Mackay that broke the stranglehold of the existing monopoly on messages between America and Europe, and it threw off a second large income for the rest of his life. He founded a Paris edition of the Herald, an American newspaper printed on European soil for the swelling crowd of American travelers and expatriates abroad. And that little paper, alone of everything he ever touched, would outlive him by generations and grow into an institution in its own right. So, the meter, in Bennett's particular case, was bolted onto engines that kept on earning while he spent. Hold that fact steady as the spending begins, because it is the reason his is the gentlest ruin of the three. However fast he turned the dial, something behind him kept quietly refilling the tank. What he chose to do with all of it, with the great newspaper and the cable money and the freedom of a man answerable to nobody on earth, was to become the most spectacular waster of his entire generation. And it began, publicly and unforgettably, on a New Year's morning at a party in front of every single person who mattered. Chapter 3. The night he ended his own wedding. On the first day of 1877, drunk and late, he walked into his fiancée's family home and disgraced himself past all possible repair. He was, at that exact moment, one of the most eligible men in the whole of America. He was engaged to be married to a young woman named Caroline May, of a respectable and well-connected family, and the engagement was the very sort of match the society pages followed closely week by week. A trousseau had already been assembled for the coming wedding, at a reported cost of $20,000, which in the money of that day was a small fortune all by itself, enough to keep an ordinary family in real comfort for years on end, all of it laid out in gowns and linens for a marriage that was now about to die in the most humiliating way any marriage has ever died. The Mays were holding a New Year's Day reception, the ordinary and expected ritual of the season, their front rooms filled with family and friends in their afternoon best, the fires lit against the hard January cold. Bennett arrived straight from a long morning of hard drinking, already far past sense, and at some point in the middle of the gathering, in full view of the assembled company, he relieved himself into the fireplace. Some accounts insist it was not the fireplace at all, but the grand piano. The exact target has been argued over ever since, and in the end, it hardly matters which of the two it was. What matters, what could never afterward be unseen, was that a grown man, the proprietor of a great newspaper, walked into the home of the family he was about to marry into and used their drawing room as a urinal in front of their guests. The engagement was finished before he had done up his trousers. There was no explaining a thing like that away. There was no apology large enough, no charm quick enough, no amount of money on earth that could ever buy the room's memory back. Caroline's brother, Frederick May, did precisely what a brother of that era was expected to do. He found Bennett the following day outside one of his clubs and horsewhipped him in the open street in front of witnesses, and then challenged him to a duel. The two men met at a lonely spot on the border between Maryland and Delaware, took their positions, and fired at 12 paces. Both of them missed clean, whether it was nerves or bad aim, or some quiet mutual understanding that neither man actually wished to die over a fireplace. The shots went wide, and both of them walked away with their lives and their so-called honor technically intact. It is remembered now as one of the last formal duels of its kind in American life, fought over one of the most undignified insults ever offered inside a respectable drawing room. Picture it a moment. Two grown men in the cold morning light, their seconds standing off to the side, pistols raised and leveled over the matter of a rich man wetting a fireplace at a New Year's party. There is the whole century in a single frozen scene, the elaborate ritual of honor wrapped tight around an act with no honor anywhere in it. And here is the thing the fireplace really tells you, the thing worth more than all the yachts put together. A poor man who did what Bennett did that morning would have lost everything in a single afternoon. His position, his prospects, his very ability to walk back into a room where decent people were standing, and the act would have followed him like a shadow to the end of his days. Bennett did it, and the only real consequence he ever paid was that he chose, from that day forward, to live somewhere warmer and more forgiving than the city that had watched him do it. The scandal that would have flattened an ordinary life for good barely dented a gilded one. That is what unlimited money quietly does to consequence itself. It dissolves the ordinary link between what a man does and what it costs him. Things that link out to nothing, until a man can commit the single most disgraceful act of his whole generation and answer for it with no more than a change of climate. The meter kept running the entire time. It did not so much as pause for the fireplace, and it would not pause again for anything he did with the 40 years he had bought himself. And then Bennett did the one thing that only his kind of money made possible. He left. Not for a season, not just until the very worst of the talk had died back down. He left the country more or less for good. He took himself off to Paris and to the warm coast of the Mediterranean, and he ran the New York Herald from the far side of an entire ocean for the next 40 years, an absentee king issuing his orders by cable to a newsroom he would scarcely set foot in ever again. Any other man alive would have been utterly ruined by that single morning, cut dead by his own set, finished in his business, forced to go and rebuild a smaller and quieter life somewhere well out of the light. Bennett simply bought distance instead. He had so much money and so many engines still earning more of it behind him that he could commit the single most disgraceful public act of his entire generation and answer the consequences of it by relocating to the French Riviera and continuing from a deck chair in the sun to be one of the richest men in America. That is the collapse to a single image for the whole of the Bennett story. A man so thickly cushioned by inherited money that he could drown his own future in one drunken gesture and pay for the privilege with nothing more costly than a change of address. So he settled into his long exile, and with the newspaper safely earning 3,000 miles behind him, he turned the full force of his attention at last to the only project that ever truly held it, the spending of money. Chapter 4. A cow, a Turkish bath, and a yacht called excess. The measure of how a man spends a fortune he cannot exhaust was riding on his yacht in a padded stall, chewing hay. But start a little earlier than that, because Bennett's spending had a signature, and the signature was always the sea. He had been a yachtsman since boyhood, and yachts, the most ruinously expensive toys the whole age had on offer, were where he spent most freely and most gloriously of all. As a very young man, he had taken a schooner called the Henrietta across the Atlantic in the dead of winter, in 1866, in the first ocean race of its kind ever run. 3 rich young men wagered $30,000, winner take all, that their boat could beat the others from New Jersey to England across a freezing December sea for no reason on this earth beyond the thrill of it and the winning of it. Bennett's boat won in a little under 14 days. That was the whole pattern of his life in miniature, set down early and clearly. Enormous sums of money laid on the table, real bodily danger accepted without a thought, and no purpose whatsoever anywhere in it beyond the sensation and the bragging rights at the finish. By the height of his exile, the yachts had grown into floating palaces. There was the Namuna, a steam yacht he used as a floating salon, filling it with artists and painters and writers and, on at least one occasion, a very young Winston Churchill. And then there was the masterpiece, the one vessel that has done more to keep his name alive than anything serious he ever attempted in his life. The Lysistrata, built at the turn of the century at a reported cost of $625,000, which in the values of that time was the price of a substantial block of a city. She ran to roughly 300 feet from stem to stern. She carried 3 separate owners' suites, one on each of 3 different decks, so that Bennett could shift himself to an entirely fresh set of rooms whenever his mood happened to change. She had a Turkish bath built into her. She carried a small theatrical troupe aboard, purely to entertain him of an evening. She had an automobile lashed to her deck for his use ashore, and, most famously of all, in a special fan-cooled stall constructed into the very body of the vessel, she carried a live milk cow, so that James Gordon Bennett Jr. would never, at any point on any ocean anywhere in the whole of the world, be forced to drink milk that had come from a strange and unfamiliar animal. Hold on to that image, because it is the whole man caught in one picture, not the yacht, the cow. A grown adult with more money than most small nations, who would sooner ship a farm animal back and forth across the Atlantic, feed it and water it and cool it with electric fans and stall it on a 300-foot pleasure boat than tolerate for one single morning the microscopic discomfort of unfamiliar cream in his coffee. It is the exact reflex of a man who has never once in the whole of his life had to accept a single thing he did not prefer. And it is precisely the same reflex he brought to the great newspaper as well, running it the very same careless way, from the very same deck chair, with the very same serene certainty that the world would always simply rearrange itself around his preferences, because for him it always had. Now, hold the scale of the man's spending all in one place for a moment, because the numbers are the whole indictment. A yacht that cost $625,000 in an age with no income tax to slow the outflow. $30,000 wagered as a boy on a single winter crossing. A trousseau of $20,000 for a wedding he ended at the fireplace. 3 owners' suites, a Turkish bath, a theater troupe, an automobile, and a cow, all riding on one boat at one time. And the rest of the spending followed the very same logic exactly. He scattered his own name across the whole map of the world by funding trophies for the pure idle sport of the thing. There was a Gordon Bennett Cup for yacht racing. There was a Gordon Bennett Cup for the brand new sport of motor cars. There was a Gordon Bennett Cup for the flying of balloons that is, astonishingly, still contested in the open air to this very day. He funded an aviation prize as well, flown for the first time before enormous crowds in France, and carried off by the American flyer Glenn Curtiss in the earliest days of powered flight. He was a legendary and impulsive giver of money, the kind of man who refused a table at a restaurant he liked in Monte Carlo, was said to have simply bought the entire restaurant outright on the spot to guarantee he could never again be turned away from it. In the panic and the hunger of a hard winter, he once opened a soup kitchen at Delmonico's to feed the poor of the city. Doused by a fire company at some point, he was said to have bought brand new overcoats for every last man in the brigade, and his name passed in the end into the everyday speech of Britain as a cry of pure astonishment, Gordon Bennett, an exclamation that people still use to this hour without the faintest idea that it once belonged to a real and living man who earned the whole reputation for the incredible by spending on a scale that made ordinary people gasp aloud. He built no lasting thing with any of it. He funded races and baths and the comfort of a cow, and all the while, 3,000 miles away across the water, the machine that quietly paid for every last part of it was beginning to fail. Chapter 5. The empire he ran into the ground by telegram. He kept the greatest newspaper in America alive by cable from a deck chair, and slowly, year by year, it died in his hands. This is where the Bennett meter tells its own particular truth, because unlike the 2 men still to come in this story, Bennett never actually ran out of money at all. His personal fortune scattered and thinned across the decades, yacht by yacht and whim by whim, but there was always more of it flowing in from the engines behind him, and he died, in the end, a genuinely rich man. What he ran through instead was something far larger and much harder to put a simple price on. He ran through an institution. He ran through the greatest newspaper fortune in the entire country, the living thing his father had bled his whole life into, and he did it not by spending it directly, but by neglecting it coldly and completely from a very great distance, for 40 unbroken years. A great newspaper is a living thing, and a living thing needs a present hand upon it. It needs an editor who walks the floor and knows his people by name. It needs a proprietor who breathes the same air as the city he serves, who feels its moods and its quarrels and its appetites in his own chest each morning. Bennett gave the Herald none of that, not for 4 long decades. He ran it from France entirely by telegram, firing good editors on a sudden cabled whim, chasing his own private feuds through the news columns, raising men up and casting men down on the strength of a passing mood wired across an ocean. All of it from a villa on the warm coast where he had fled after the fireplace, and to which he had never truly meant to return. For a while, the sheer momentum his father had built into the thing carried it forward all the same. But the world of newspapers did not stand still and wait politely for him. Rivals modernized and invested and innovated. They walked their own floors and felt their own cities in their bones, while the Herald drifted along under an absentee king who genuinely seemed to believe that a great newspaper could be operated exactly like a yacht, by preference, from a chair, at the very far end of a long electric wire. Slowly the paper lost its lead, and then its readers, and then its place at the front of the pack, and no cable order from the coast of France could reverse the drift, because the true problem was the man himself, sitting at the far end of the cable. It is a strange kind of ruin to sit and watch, because it is so quiet and so slow that for years you could almost miss it happening at all. There is no crash anywhere in it, no scandal, no single ruinous night at a table. There is only a great and living thing, handed to a man who found it rather less interesting than his boats, wearing steadily down, year upon year, for want of a hand laid upon it. The way a garden goes back to weeds if nobody tends it, not violently, not all at once, just quietly, back toward wilderness. Bennett never smashed the Herald in a rage. He simply let it slide from a deck chair, in the warm sun, 3,000 miles away across the water. And the sliding took whole decades to run its course only because there was so very much of the thing to slide. A smaller fortune, he would have finished off in a year or two of the same treatment. This one was so enormous that even his pure and settled indifference needed 40 long years to spend it all the way down to the bottom. He lived to 77 years of age. He married for the very first time, only at 73, to a widow, a bare 4 years before the end of his life. And he died in 1918 at his villa on the French Riviera, comfortable, wealthy, childless, and finished, with no son and no daughter to leave a penny of any of it to. And then came the final reading of the account, the last number the meter had been running toward all along, except that in Bennett's case, the number was not a sum of money at all, but the fate of the paper itself. Within 2 years of his death, the New York Herald, the most powerful newspaper in America on the day he first inherited it, was sold off to a buyer named Frank Munsey. Within 6 years, it had been folded into a rival and had ceased to exist as an independent name altogether, its long life quietly over. The heir had outlived his own father's empire by 2 short years. The empire did not outlive the heir by 6. He had been given the single greatest thing a father of that whole age could hand a son, an engine that made money and made history in the very same breath. And he had spent it on distance and comfort and a cow, and when he was gone at last, the engine was quietly broken up for parts. That is the gentlest ruin in this entire story. Bennett spent the most of the 3 and lost the very least of himself. He was never poor, never destitute, never for a single day personally destroyed. He simply took a great and living thing and let it die of his own inattention while he amused himself in the sun. The next man had no newspaper standing behind him, and no second income, and no engine of any kind at his back at all. He had a rope fortune and an extraordinarily good tailor, and when he set about spending, there was nothing whatsoever left refilling the tank. Chapter 6. The man whose whole career was getting dressed. Evander Berry Wall inherited a rope fortune and spent his entire life proving that a man could waste one on nothing whatsoever but tailoring. The money had come out of Brooklyn, out of a firm called the Wall Rope Works, founded by his grandfather back in 1830, honest industrial money made from a thing the whole shipping age genuinely needed, coils and cables and cordage for a nation that still moved the great bulk of its goods by water. It was not a glamorous fortune in the least. It was rope, but it was entirely real, and it was large, and by the time it came down at last to young Berry Wall, it had grown into serious and substantial wealth. He came into a reported $2 million by roughly the time he was 22 years old, and by his own later reckoning, he ran through across the length of his life, two whole separate fortunes, each one of them well over $1 million. And here is the distinction that makes Wall the very strangest of the three men in this story. Because at the least, Bennett bought yachts and funded expeditions and ran, however badly, a great and famous business. Wall did none of that. Wall's entire life's work, his whole visible output, the complete sum total of what he ever did with a rope manufacturing fortune, was to be extraordinarily, exquisitely, professionally well-dressed. That was the career. That was the whole of it, start to finish. He was crowned, in the slang of the day, the king of the dudes, a dude being a man of excessive and almost religious attention to his own clothing, and Wall wore that title as though it were an actual public office he had somehow been elected to. The newspapers, who found him endlessly and reliably entertaining, first mocked him as a champion nincompoop, and then, warming to him, hailed him properly as King of the Dudes at the New Jersey resort of Long Branch in the summer of 1883, and he held the crown by the common agreement of the amused press for years afterward. It was an age that watched its rich men closely and wrote about them daily, and Wall gave that press a gift, a man so devoted to his own appearance that his mornings were news. There is something worth seeing clearly in that, because it tells you a great deal about what the age itself secretly valued. Here was a whole country in the very middle of building railroads and steel mills and cities out of the raw ground. A country that prized hard work and self-making above almost every other virtue it claimed, and yet it made a minor and affectionate celebrity out of a man whose single accomplishment in the world was that he dressed better than anybody else and did nothing whatsoever besides. The newspapers did not hold Berry Wall up in order to shame the idle rich. They held him up because their readers were genuinely delighted by him, because a man who could afford to treat his own wardrobe as a full life's work was a kind of living wonder, a walking proof of just how far a large enough fortune could carry a person clean past any ordinary human need to be useful to anyone. He was not hiding what he was, and nobody asked him to. He was openly and warmly celebrated for it. And that easy celebration is the quiet scandal sitting underneath all the funny stories. A whole society agreeing, for a good long while, that the very best thing a rich young man could possibly do with the fortune 3 hard generations had built for him was to be beautifully, uselessly, expensively looked at. The most famous story of all about him, and it is important to be honest about this particular one, is almost certainly far more legend than it is fact. The tale, told and retold down the decades until it hardened into something people simply took for history, holds that during a long stretch of reign at the fashionable spa of Saratoga, Wall won a wager among the assembled dandies by changing his clothes 40 separate times between breakfast and dinner, appearing in 40 complete and different outfits over the course of a single day, to settle once and for all the burning question of who was the best-dressed man present. The story has been repeated for well over a century now. It has also been traced by the people who went looking hard for its source, to versions that only surfaced decades after the supposed event, versions that flatly contradict one another about who was even involved in it. The likelier truth is a smaller and far better documented episode from the streets of New York in 1887, when Wall and a rival dandy, an actor named Bob Hilliard, met by pure chance on Fifth Avenue dressed in very nearly identical clothes, and Wall answered the silent challenge of it by disappearing and then reappearing in 3 fresh and complete outfits over the course of the day, until the rival gave up the field to him at last and went home beaten. 40 changes or 3. The joke underneath is exactly the same joke, and it only sharpens when you notice that the single most famous deed of the King of the Dudes is a deed he very probably never actually did. About clothes. His reign, such as it was, ended not in scandal, but in marriage. In the winter of 1887, he married a woman named Salome Melbourne, and a married man, the papers agreed with some real regret, could no longer truly be the King of the Dudes. Chapter 7. $12,000 and a very good coat. The best-dressed man in America drained 2 whole fortunes $1 tailored dollar at a time, and never once seemed to notice it happening. There was no single catastrophe anywhere in Wall's finances. No ruinous night at the tables, no yacht that swallowed a fortune whole in a single afternoon. There was only the wardrobe, and the resorts, and the grand hotels, and the long, comfortable, entirely pointless business of being looked at. His clothes were counted and recounted by an amused and affectionate press in figures that never quite agree with one another. Hundreds upon hundreds of pairs of trousers, thousands of neckties, suits cut by the great London tailor Poole, so very many trunks that traveling anywhere at all with him was said to require a small freight operation all its own. That very instability in the numbers is the honest part of it. Nobody could count them, because the whole idea from the very beginning was that they could not be counted, that here was a man who owned more clothes than a single human life could ever hope to wear out, and who had made that surplus his one lasting contribution to the world. He kept a small dog on a ribbon and a suite of the best rooms wherever he went, and an air of perfect unhurried leisure, and he was, for a while, one of the most photographed men in the whole of America, famous for absolutely nothing at all except the way that he looked standing still. Try to hold the sheer emptiness of that in your mind for a moment, because the emptiness is the entire point of him. Other men of his age were out building the very things the coming century would run on, the wires and the rails and the engines. Wall was choosing a necktie. Other men were failing and struggling and gambling and clawing their way towards some kind of greatness, or breaking themselves against it. Wall was being fitted for a coat. Decade upon decade of it, the resorts and the grand hotels and the tailors and the 17 trunks. A life with the exact outward shape of a permanent holiday, and almost none of the inward content of a life at all. And behind every hour of it, the meter turning quietly the whole time, drawing that solid old rope fortune steadily down toward the small and final figure that sat waiting for it at the end of the road. He was, in his own genteel and perfectly harmless way, the most complete waster of the three men in this story, because the other two at least wanted things, real things, a newspaper to command, a name to carry, a fast horse, a win at the tables under the lights. Wall wanted only to be looked at and admired, and he spent a whole fortune and a whole lifetime successfully getting it. And then he died. Two fortunes go a very long way, but they do not go on forever, and in time the American money was simply and quietly gone, drained away into tailoring and hotel bills and the daily upkeep of a reputation for elegance. In 1912, Wall moved to Europe for good, settling into a suite at a grand hotel in Paris and drifting between the fashionable French resort towns, an aging American dandy, living out his long exile on the far side of the ocean, from the fortune he had already spent down to nothing. He was kept back from actual poverty by a single small mercy he had done nothing at all to earn. His brother, a far more careful and sensible man, had died years before, and left Berry a modest trust, and the steady interest thrown off by that trust, a couple of $100,000 set carefully aside by a sibling with rather more sense than he had ever shown, was very nearly the whole of what stood in the final decades between the king of the dudes and outright destitution. The wastrel's long and comfortable twilight was paid for in the end by the one member of the family who had never once been a wastrel himself. There is a small bitter lesson tucked into that, and it points straight ahead toward the trust that would one day save the Vanderbilt fortune from the last man in this story. And then the meter stopped, and the final number was read aloud. And in Wall's case, that number is the single most eloquent figure in this entire video. Evander Berry Wall died in Paris in 1940, an old man far from the country of his birth. He had inherited a reported $2 million. He had run through, by his own accounting, 2 full fortunes, each of them over $1 million. And the estate he left behind him, the total sum of everything that remained after a whole lifetime of being the best-dressed man in America, came to $12,608. Set those numbers down side by side, and you hold the whole of the man in the palm of your hand. 2 fortunes over $1 million each at the start of it. $12,608 at the very end. The meter had run almost exactly to zero, and the man had literally nothing at all to show for a life of great wealth but a wardrobe, a nickname, and a memoir that appeared just after his death. A memoir in which he looked back across all of it and described, without a single flicker of regret anywhere in the pages, a life of gaiety and pleasure, fuller than that which falls to most men. A humorist of the day wrote the truest epitaph anybody ever managed for him. He was headed nowhere, and he arrived. Wall wasted only his own money and his own years. He married late, fathered no children of any consequence, ruined nobody at all on this earth but himself, and drifted out of the world, at last leaving behind him a good tailor's fond regard and a very funny story that he had most likely invented from whole cloth. That is the middle rung of this ladder we have been climbing, the pure and total and self-contained waste of a man who harmed no living soul but his own. The last man was another matter entirely. The last man held the biggest fortune of the three, and the most famous name in all of America. And when he set about burning through everything he could reach, the fire did not stop politely with him. It reached all the way down a whole generation, and it took hold of a child. Chapter 8. $10 million and a boy who never had to be anything. Reginald Claypool. Vanderbilt carried the most famous name in American money and used it to become nothing at all. To understand the sheer size of what this last one was handed, go all the way back to the source of the name itself. His great-great-grandfather was Cornelius Vanderbilt, the man they called the Commodore, a ferryman's son from Staten Island who had begun with a single small boat carrying passengers across the harbor for pennies, and clawed his way up from there, first through a fleet of steamships, and then through the railroads that were remaking the whole country until he died. At the end of it, the richest man in America, having assembled the single largest private fortune the nation had ever seen up to that hour. He was hard and coarse and grasping and brilliant, and he left a mountain of money behind him. That fortune passed down through the family, and it grew larger as it went, and by the time it reached Reggie's own father, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the family sat at the absolute summit of American wealth and American society together, in the grandest of all the great Fifth Avenue mansions, and in the vast Newport cottage they called the Breakers, a palace by the sea thrown open for a handful of golden weeks each summer and shuttered the rest of the year. Reggie was the youngest son of that house. He was born at the very top of the very top, the great-great-grandson of the man who had built the whole towering thing up from a rowboat, with a surname that opened every door in America before he had so much as said a single word for himself. What the surname did not come attached to was any expectation whatsoever that he do a single useful thing with his life. He came into roughly $10 million on the day he reached his majority, a sum so vast in the money of that era that the yearly interest on it alone would have kept a man comfortably in the very first rank of American wealth, for life, without his ever once needing to touch the principal underneath it. And years later, when his older brother Alfred went down with the Lusitania, torpedoed and sunk off the coast of Ireland in the war, Reggie inherited a further reported $5 million out of that estate. $15 million all told, across the length of his life, handed freely and without condition to a man who had never earned and would never in all his days earn a single dollar of his own making. Set that fortune down beside the world it came out of, and the waste of it comes sharply into focus. The Vanderbilt name at the turn of the century was not merely rich. It was the very standard against which all American wealth measured itself, the family that other families studied and envied and schemed and married to get near. To be born a Vanderbilt in those years was to be born already arrived, already seated at the absolute summit of a society that thousands upon thousands of ambitious and hungry people spent whole lifetimes and whole fortunes clawing their way toward, and mostly never reached at all. Every important door in America stood open to Reggie before he could so much as walk through it on his own. Every hostess in the country would have moved heaven and earth itself to seat him at her dinner table. He had been handed, at birth and entirely for free, the one single thing that all that anxious striving new money out there was straining and scheming and marrying its daughters off to buy, which was a secure and unquestioned place at the very top of everything from the first breath he ever drew. And with the whole of that laid down at his feet, he chose, across 45 years, to do with it precisely and exactly nothing. The horses were his one saving grace, and we keep them in view for a reason, because a man who can drive a team of 4, clean and true through a crowded show ring, is plainly not a man born without any gifts. He was only a man who was never once in the whole of his life required to spend those gifts on a single thing that mattered. There is one thing to be said in his favor, and the mockery this story runs on can well afford to stop and say it, because it is small and because it is entirely true. Reggie was genuinely good at one thing, and the one thing was horses. He was a serious and widely respected horseman, an expert driver of a four-in-hand coach, a real judge of horseflesh, a fixture, and an officer of the great horse show societies of the country, president of more than one of them, and the master of a fine Rhode Island breeding farm he called Sandy Point. In an age that gave its rich young men absolutely nothing at all that they were required to do, Reggie had at least found a real skill and pursued it with real and genuine competence. And if only the story ended there, in the show ring, up behind a good team of horses on a bright morning, it might almost stand as something close to admirable. But the show ring was only ever the hobby, and never for one moment anything more than the hobby. The true vocation, the thing he pursued with the very most dedication and the very largest sums of money, was the losing of it. And he began early, and he began at the card table. Chapter 9. $75,000 across one table. Before he was even 25 years old, he could lose in a single night what a working man would not earn in a lifetime of hard labor. The room where he lost it was one of the most famous gambling houses in all of America, run by a celebrated and discreet operator named Richard Canfield, a quiet and luxurious establishment where the sons of the great fortunes came to lose their father's money in perfect comfort and perfect privacy. The rooms were beautiful and furnished like a great private house, quiet and discreet, and closed to the ordinary world outside. The play was deep and it was serious, and the house, as the house always does in the very end, won and went on winning. Reggie was among Canfield's very best customers, which is only another way of saying that he was among his most reliable and most generous losers. And the single figure that has come down to us from his young manhood is staggering even now, in an age long grown, used to enormous numbers. On one single evening at Canfield's tables, the young Reginald Vanderbilt was reported to have lost as much as $75,000. Sit with that one sum a moment in the money of its own day, because the scale of it is the whole point, and the scale of it is the entire indictment against him. $75,000 in the first years of the century was a genuine fortune all on its own. It was many, many times over what a skilled and careful workman could hope to earn across the whole of his working life. It was the price of several fine houses standing side by side on a good street. It was enough, invested with any sense at all, to keep an ordinary family in real security for a generation or more. And a young man, not yet even old enough to have earned a single honest cent of his own, lost the entire sum of it across one table in one night. And then, one can only imagine, simply ordered himself another drink and turned back to the game, because there was always more of it standing behind him, because the great principle his father had handed him seemed, to a boy of his years and his particular upbringing, as bottomless and as endless as the sea itself. There is a particular kind of blindness that only great inherited money can grow inside a person, and Reggie had it in full measure. A man who has earned his own money knows in his very body what a sum of it is worth, because he can still feel the hours and the years that went into the making of it. A man who was simply handed his has no such knowledge anywhere inside him at all. To Reggie, $75,000 lost across a single night was not a fortune vanishing off the table in front of him. It was a number written on a card, an abstraction, a thing as weightless and as endlessly replaceable as the chips stacked up at his elbow, because he had never once in his life felt the true weight of a single dollar earned. That is the reason the losing never frightened him into stopping, while he still had something left to save. You cannot be truly frightened of losing a thing whose value you have never once understood. The tables did not ruin Reginald Vanderbilt merely because they took his money away from him, night after expensive night. They ruined him because they revealed over and over again under the quiet lamps that he had no earthly idea what money actually was, and neither the wit, nor the need, nor the will ever to learn it. His answer to the reckoning that came next tells you more about the man than any words he ever left behind him, and he left almost none at all, and that very silence is itself a kind of portrait of him. When the district attorney of New York, a determined reforming prosecutor, set hard on breaking the great gambling houses of the city, went after Canfield and his whole operation, he needed witnesses in order to do it, and the wealthy young men who had lost fortunes at those tables were the obvious ones to put up on the stand. Reginald Vanderbilt was called, subpoenaed to testify under oath about exactly what he had lost in that house. And rather than sit in an open courtroom and say aloud, in front of the assembled world, how much money he had thrown away across Canfield's green bays, Reggie dodged the subpoena entirely. He would not say the number. The sums were too large, too humiliating, too plainly and completely damning to be spoken out loud in public. And so, The very man who had lost them quietly arranged not to be found and not to be served. That is the closest thing to a self-portrait Reginald Vanderbilt ever gave the world. Not a word of defiance, not a word of shame, not a word of any kind at all. Just a rich young man slipping quietly out a side door, rather than confess out loud what his idleness had already cost him, while the meter, entirely unwatched, went right on running. And run it did, because the cards were only ever the beginning of it. There was the drink as well, and the drink took longer, and the drink, in the end, took everything he had left. Chapter 10. The slow suicide of a sporting man. There was never any single crisis in the long end of Reggie Vanderbilt, only a slow and amiable slide with a glass held loosely in his hand. This is the part of his story that the tragic register would dearly love to slow right down and grieve over at real length. And this channel will not do it, because there is nothing genuinely tragic about a man given every conceivable advantage on earth who chooses, year by comfortable year, to drink his own way out of the world. The drinking was the one great constant of his adult life. Through the horse shows and the card tables and the 2 marriages, through the whole of his 30s and on into his 40s, Reggie drank, steadily and heavily, and without any apparent struggle against it, in the settled and unhurried manner of a man with nothing at all to get up for in the morning, and all the money in the whole world to get up with. It was not some secret vice hidden carefully away in shame. It was simply the daily texture of a life that had nothing else in it to give the days their shape. The word the age itself used for a man like Reggie was a sporting man, and it was not entirely meant as an insult, which is part of what makes him so difficult to be truly angry at and so dangerously easy to pity if you let yourself, which we will not. A sporting man kept fine horses and kept late hours and kept a good seat at the best tables. And he did all of it with a certain easy, unhurried grace. And he hurt almost nobody much beyond himself and the handful of people unwise enough to love him. That was the whole trap of it. There was nothing monstrous in Reggie to recoil from, no cruelty in him, no cold scheme, no villainy the eye could catch hold of and condemn outright. There was only a pleasant, weak, agreeable man drifting through a long and comfortable series of well-appointed rooms, a glass always somewhere within reach of his hand, spending a whole ocean of inherited money on nothing in particular, and quietly calling it a life, right up until the late summer day. His own body simply stopped agreeing to the arrangement. The sporting life looked, from the outside, a great deal like freedom. It was really only a slow and a pleasant way of disappearing. He married twice over the course of it. His first marriage, made in 1903 to a young woman of his own, set named Kathleen Nielsen, gave him a daughter, and then slowly came apart in the divorce courts after a decade and a half of it. His second marriage was the one the newspapers truly loved. In 1923, at the age of 42, his health already visibly and audibly going, Reggie married a girl of just 19, named Gloria Morgan, barely half his own age, a great beauty out of an American diplomatic family. And in the following year, she bore him another daughter, and they named the child Gloria after her young mother. So there he stood, past 40, his liver already failing him, his fortune already years deep into the long, slow drain, married to a teenager and a new father all over again. The very portrait in oils of a man who had never once in his whole life been asked to grow up and had never for a moment seen any reason to start. The papers followed the marriage as they followed everything he did, the famous name, the great age gap, the beautiful young bride, the new baby, all of it copy for a public that could not look away from the rich. Watch the shape of those 2 marriages for a moment, because they tell the very same story that the card tables tell. A man of real substance, a man with genuine work in his life and a purpose to his days, tends to build a marriage around those larger things, to bring a wife into a life that is already going somewhere. Reggie had nothing at all to build a marriage around except himself, and so both of his have the strange airless quality of a man simply arranging pleasant company for a life with no other structure anywhere inside it. The first one came and it left a daughter behind it. The second one set a visibly failing man of 42 down beside a bright and hopeful girl of 19, and produced another daughter before the end came. He was not a cruel man, by the accounts that have survived him, and he was not, in any large or dramatic sense, a wicked one either. He was something quieter than that, and in its own way far sadder to look at squarely. He was a man to whom nothing at all had ever happened that he himself had not chosen, and who had chosen, with all the freedom in the entire world at his fingertips, to fill up the years with drink and company and horses, and to let his own body quietly keep the running account of it. And the body kept that account faithfully to the last penny, and the body closed it out at 45. And then, at last, the body sent in its bill for all of it. The long, slow years of hard drinking had done to Reggie's liver exactly what long years of hard drinking do to a liver. And in the late summer of 1925, at Sandy Point Farm, the farm where he kept his horses, the single patch of ground anywhere on earth where his one real skill had ever lived and breathed, Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt died. He was 45 years old. The cause of it was the failing of a body destroyed patiently and thoroughly from the inside out, the ruin of the liver and the internal bleeding that comes along in its train, the ordinary and thoroughly unglamorous death of the long-term heavy drinker in the end. He had been handed $15 million across the years and the single most famous name in the whole country, and he had reached the exhausted end of himself at 45, worn all the way through, lying on the one piece of the earth where he had ever done a single thing well. The meter, you would surely think, had finally and completely run itself all the way down to nothing. And then the will was read aloud in that quiet office, and the strangest thing in all the world happened, and it turned out that the meter had never really, truly been his to run in the first place. Chapter 11. The fortune his father hid from him. When they read the will aloud, the money was still there, and that single fact was the cruelest and coldest verdict of them all. Because here at last is the twist that makes Reginald Vanderbilt the perfect and terrible center of this whole story. His father, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, had not been a fool, and he had not been a blind man either. The old man had looked long and hard at this youngest son of his, had seen, one really has to assume, exactly the sporting, drinking, card-losing boy that the wider world would in time come to know so very well, and had made a cold and clear-eyed decision about precisely how to leave him the family money. He did not simply hand Reggie the $10 million to do with entirely as he pleased. He tied the great bulk of it up in a trust, a careful legal instrument that gave Reggie the income to live on, lavishly for the whole of his natural life. But that placed the principal itself, the great untouchable body of the fortune, forever beyond the reach of his hands. Reggie could spend, freely and forever, whatever the money happened to earn. He could never, under any circumstance in the world, get at the money itself. And so, when the final accounting was at last done on the wreck of his life, the estate still came to roughly $6.25 million, the great protected core of the fortune, sitting exactly where his father had locked it away decades before, having survived intact everything the son could possibly throw against it, for the simple and entirely sufficient reason that the son had never once been able to get his hands around it in the first place. It passed on, precisely as the old man had intended that it should all along, straight over Reggie's head and down to Reggie's own daughters. His young widow was allowed a share of it, but a share that was strictly capped, held to a firm written limit, along with a townhouse in the city and the farm out at Sandy Point where he had died. The money did not survive because Reggie had ever been careful with a penny of it. It survived because his own father had reached out from beyond the grave itself and held it clear of the boy's reaching hands, coldly and correctly certain that his son would go on to destroy absolutely anything at all that he was ever permitted to destroy. It is worth being precise about how unusual and how quietly damning that whole arrangement really was, because a father does not do such a thing to a son, lightly or by accident. To lock a grown man out of his own inheritance, to leave him the interest for life but wall off the principal from his hands forever, is a father saying, in the cold and careful and permanent language of the law, that he does not trust this particular man with the thing he spent his life building. It is a verdict handed down inside a legal document, written to be read out only after both of them are long past the point of arguing about it face to face. Most fathers of great fortune in that age simply handed their sons the money outright, and then hoped quietly for the best. Cornelius Vanderbilt II looked hard at Reggie and declined to hope at all. He arranged instead to be proven right. And he was proven right. And the whole proof of just how right he had been is the simple fact that there was anything left over at the end to argue about. Every dollar that survived down to those two young daughters is a dollar their own grandfather had refused in advance to let their father lay a finger on. the one clear-eyed adult in the entire story who understood exactly what Reggie was, had been dead and buried for years before Reggie got around to proving him correct. Read that verdict for exactly what it is, because it is the coldest single thing in this entire video, and it was written and signed by the man's own father. Cornelius Vanderbilt II looked squarely at his own living son and drew up a legal arrangement whose entire and only purpose was to protect the family fortune from that son's own hands. And he was right to do it. Every single year of Reggie's adult life went on to prove the old man right. At the card table, and at the bar, and in the long, comfortable slide, down to the end, at Sandy Point. The one and only reason there was any Vanderbilt money at all left to argue over when Reggie died, at 45, was that the boy had been judged correctly and coldly and well in advance, as a man who could not be trusted for one single moment with a fortune of his own. Remember the trust we spoke of at the very start of all this, the one break the whole age had invented against exactly this kind of heir. Here it is, doing its work. And remember too that the fathers of Bennett and of Wall never once thought to reach for it, and watch what that difference did, and argue over the surviving money the family most certainly did, in the most public way the age could possibly manage, because the daughter that trust had been built to protect was still a baby when her father drank himself into the ground. And around that baby, and around the great flow of income that came attached to her small person, the family was about to tear itself very publicly to pieces. Chapter 12. The poor little rich girl he left behind. His rot did not stop politely at the edge of his own grave. It reached over it, and it became the childhood of a small girl. The daughter of Reggie's second marriage, the little Gloria named for her teenage mother, was an infant still when her father drank himself to death, and she came into the world attached to a thing that made her, in the cold arithmetic of the surviving family, rather less a child to be loved than an asset to be controlled. She was the beneficiary of a trust, and whoever held control of the child held control, in turn, of the flow of a very great deal of money. And so, this one small girl became, almost from the very moment her father was in the ground, the glittering prize in a bitter and public struggle among the very adults who were meant above everything else to love her and to shield her from harm. It is the single clearest proof anywhere in this whole story that the idle heir's ruin does not end neatly with the heir himself. Reggie was gone. The damage he had set into motion went right on moving through the world without him. In 1934, the whole long struggle finally broke wide open into one of the most notorious court cases of the entire Depression, a custody trial that the newspapers of the country devoured hungrily for weeks on end. On the one side of it stood Gloria Morgan, the young widow, the girl who had married at 19, now grown into a woman fighting hard to hold on to her own daughter. On the other side of it stood Reggie's own formidable sister, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, the child's aunt, moving with all the enormous weight of the family behind her to take the girl away from her mother. The trial dragged the family's most private life through the public papers in the most lurid detail imaginable, day after day. A running spectacle of enormous inherited wealth and deep private dysfunction served up fresh to a country that was standing in the very year in breadlines that stretched clear around the block, and all of it was being fought out over the small head of the 10-year-old daughter, of the man who had gambled and drunk his careless way into an early grave. The newspapers found a name for the child that stuck to her hard for the rest of her days. The poor little rich girl. She had a great fortune and no peace at all, a famous name, and no ordinary childhood anywhere to speak of. And she owed both halves of that cruel bargain squarely and entirely to a father who had done nothing whatsoever in his entire life but spend. There is a bitter symmetry in what that trial finally became. A man had spent the whole of his life turning money into nothing at all, and now, years after he was safely in the ground, the money he had left behind him, the money his own careful father had saved from his hands, turned his small daughter into a battlefield. The adults fought bitterly over the child because she came into the world attached to an income, and the newspapers in turn fought over the adults because the whole glittering spectacle of it sold papers by the ton, and the little girl sat there in the very middle of the storm, 10 years old, quietly learning the first great lesson of her family, which is that a fortune does not buy a person any peace and very often flatly forbids it. She had done nothing at all to earn any part of it, neither the money nor the misery that came bolted onto it. exactly as her father before her had done nothing at all to earn the great fortune that started the whole long slide. She had simply been born, precisely as he had been born, at the very top of everything, into a pile of wealth she had never once asked for. The difference between them, the single saving difference, is what she chose to do about it all, once she was finally grown and free. And that one difference is very nearly the only hopeful thing anywhere in this entire story. Follow that little girl forward in time, though, because the very last turn of the whole long Vanderbilt story is the one that finally, at long last, breaks the pattern for good. The poor little rich girl grew up to become Gloria Vanderbilt, and she went on, in her own life, to do the one single thing that not one of the three men in this video ever so much as attempted even once. She worked. She built, out of her own real talent and her own famous name together, a genuine career and a design house, and a fortune of her own actual making. The very first person in this whole sorry descending line to add something new to the pile rather than only ever subtract from it. And her son, a boy she raised deliberately and carefully to expect nothing at all handed to him for free, grew up to be a journalist whose face a great deal of the country knows on sight, a man who has said plainly and publicly, more than once and without any hedging, that he was left essentially no inheritance and that he wanted it precisely and exactly that way, that he regards a great inherited pot of money as far more of a curse laid quietly across a life than any kind of a gift to it. Somewhere down in the wreckage of Reggie Vanderbilt, drunk and dead at 45, with his own fortune locked carefully away from him by a distrustful father, a family finally, painfully, at long last, learned the one lesson that the whole of the Gilded Age had never once thought to teach a single one of its sons. That to be handed everything is the surest and the straightest road there is to becoming nothing at all. Chapter 13. They owned everything, and it saved none of them. The usual story this channel sits down to tell is the story of a woman who owned millions and yet controlled nothing at all. These three men controlled everything, and it destroyed them all the same. That is the reversal genuinely worth sitting still with for a moment, because it cuts hard against the easy and comfortable assumption that money is simply freedom, and that freedom is always and simply a good thing for a person to be handed. The women of the Gilded Age were so very often trapped by their own great wealth, married off as instruments of family alliance, denied the plain right to sign or to spend or to leave, owning enormous fortunes on paper, that the law and the family between them kept forever and completely out of their reach. Bennett and Wall and Vanderbilt were the exact photographic negative of all of that. They could do anything at all that they liked. They could spend anything, go anywhere on the whole of the earth, refuse anyone, indulge any appetite the very instant it happened to arrive in them. No law anywhere constrained them in the slightest. No family sold them off. No door in the entire world was ever closed against them. They held the one single thing that the trapped and gilded heiresses could only lie awake at night and dream of: total and unquestioned command of their own money and their own lives. And you have watched, across this last hour and a half, exactly what the three of them chose to do with it. The money did not corrupt these men by dragging them down into vice. It corrupted them by quietly removing every last reason they might ever have had to become anything at all. That is the deeper truth lying underneath all three of these lives, and it is worth stating just as plainly as it can possibly be put. The whiskey and the cards and the yachts and the endless wardrobe were never actually the disease itself. They were only ever the symptoms of it, the outward signs of the thing eating away underneath. The disease was idleness, underwritten by more wealth than any idleness could ever hope to fully exhaust. A life with every single door standing wide open, and no earthly reason to walk through any one of them, and it hollowed these three men out just as surely and just as completely as any poverty ever hollowed out a poor one. They were three different depths of one single sickness. One of them had a fortune that outlived him because a machine kept refilling it faster than he could pour it away. One of them had a fortune that died at very nearly the same moment he did, drained all the way down to $12,000 and a little loose change. And one of them had a fortune that survived him at all, only because a wiser and colder man had reached out and hidden it away from his hands. And the monuments that the three of them left behind tell precisely the very same story that the cold numbers do. Not a great newspaper, which was broken up and scrapped within 6 years. Not a great house. Not a great work. Not a great anything at all. a phrase of astonishment, a nickname, a custody trial, and a cow on a yacht. 3 men handed the whole wide world between them, and among the 3 of them, not one single durable thing built, not one honest dollar earned, not one life anywhere on earth that genuinely needed them to be in it. And this is why the inversion matters so much, why it is worth turning over slowly in the hand rather than rushing straight past it to the end. We are taught, almost from the day we are born, to imagine that money would fix us, that with enough of it in the bank, we would somehow become freer and larger and finer versions of the people we already are. These 3 lives are that very experiment, run all the way out to its conclusion, with every single variable that normally hems a person simply removed from the equation. No want anywhere, no boss above them, no wall around them, no law against them, no door in the world closed to them. Just a man, and a great fortune, and all the time there is. And the result, 3 separate times over, was a smaller life rather than a larger one, a man visibly diminished by the exact freedom that was supposed to enlarge him. That is the finding of the experiment, and it is not a comfortable finding to sit with, because it means the very thing we are all quietly told to spend our lives chasing is also, when it is handed over too completely and too early and too easily, a kind of slow poison. The freedom that should have enlarged these men did the precise opposite to every one of them. It excused them, fully and permanently, from ever having to become anyone at all. And so, the 3 of them stand together there at the end, in a kind of grim and perfect symmetry. 3 separate answers to the same question the whole age never once thought to ask its favored sons. What is a man actually for, once he no longer has to be for anything at all? Bennett answered the question with a cow on a yacht and a great newspaper quietly left to rot from neglect. Wall answered it with a wardrobe, and a memoir full of contentment, and $12,000. Vanderbilt answered it with a card table, and a bottle, and a locked trust, and a frightened little girl left standing in the wreckage. 3 different answers, given in 3 different theaters, and underneath every one of them, the very same silence, the same flat absence where a purpose in a life should have been. They are not remembered today as wicked men, and in truth they were not, particularly. They are barely remembered at all, which is its own kind of final verdict, and very nearly the worst one available to men who were handed the whole of the world and asked, in effect, to do just one thing with it. Chapter 14. What they did with everything. Every one of them woke up each and every single morning with a freedom that most people alive will never once in their entire lives so much as touch. Think hard for a moment about what that freedom actually was. In the flesh, because we say the word inheritance so very easily and so very often that we forget entirely what it truly meant inside these 3 particular lives. It meant that James Gordon Bennett Jr. could disgrace himself utterly, past all forgiveness, in a stranger's own drawing room, and answer the ruin of it by moving to the Riviera and buying himself a great yacht with a live cow on the deck. It meant that Evander Berry Wall could decide, freely and finally, that his one lasting contribution to the entire human record would be the particular way that he happened to wear a coat, and could spend 2 whole fortunes proving the small point, and die at last with $12,000, and a memoir brimming over with contentment. It meant that Reginald Vanderbilt could lose $75,000 across a single night and slip quietly out a side door, rather than admit to it under oath, and drink himself all the way into the ground by 45, and the one solitary reason his family kept $1 of the money was that his own father had seen him clearly from the very start, and locked it away. They had, every one of them, the very thing that the whole wide world is forever told that it ought to want above all else. They had money without any limit at all on it, and freedom without any single condition attached to it. No boss standing above them, no clock ticking in front of them, no need at all pressing behind them, not a solitary soul on the whole of the earth able to tell any one of them, no. Bennett had the greatest newspaper in America and a second fortune in ocean cable and every open sea in the world to sail across, and he spent it all on distance, and a Turkish bath, and the comfort of a cow. Wall had 2 full fortunes and an old and honorable name and every glittering resort in Europe laid out before him, and he spent it all on tailoring and died holding the bare price of a modest little house. Vanderbilt had $15 million and the most famous surname in the whole of the country, and a real and honest gift for one clean thing. And he spent it all on cards and on drink, and left behind him a baby daughter the family would fight over for weeks in open court. Every advantage the whole age could possibly offer a man, poured freely into 3 sets of open and idle hands, and this, in the very end, is what they did with all of it. Nothing. They did nothing at all with everything. Picture, one last time, the exact thing that each of them was actually handed, because the sheer size of the gift is the only true measure of the waste of it. A man was handed a printing press that could shape the very thoughts of a nation, and he used it to keep a cow comfortable at sea. A man was handed the freedom to become anything at all that a fortune could make of him, and he used it to become a rack of very fine coats. A man was handed the most trusted name in America, and a real and honest gift held in his own 2 hands, and he used it to lose money in the dark and to drink until his body finally quit on him. Every one of them could have built something. Every one of them could have given something away. Every one of them could have become a person a whole country remembered for some good reason. And every one of them, standing there at the wide open door with the entire world laid out on the other side of it, chose instead to sit back down and pour himself another glass. That is the sermon this story quietly preaches, and it preaches it 3 separate times, and the third and last time, it preaches it out loud over the head of a sleeping child. And the money, in the very end, tells the plain truth about all 3 of them, because the meter always stops turning eventually, and someone always reads the final number aloud in a quiet room. For Bennett, it was the great newspaper sold off and folded away and gone within 6 years of his death. For Wall, it was $12,608, set against 2 lost fortunes over $1 million each. And for Reggie, it was a will that laid bare the coldest verdict a father ever passed down upon a son, a fortune deliberately and carefully kept out of the boy's own reaching hands because the boy could not be trusted for one single moment to keep it. Go back, one very last time, to that will, back to where the whole of this began, to the strangest line in all of Reginald Vanderbilt's estate, the money that was somehow, impossibly, still there. A father had looked at his own son and known, with a cold and perfect certainty, exactly what the boy would do with a free hand, and had hidden the fortune away from him, and had been proven right by every single ordinary day of that son's short life. There is no more complete indictment of an idle heir anywhere than that one. His own father saw it coming. A humorist once wrote a single line about the emptiest of these 3 lives, and he meant it, at the time, only as a passing little joke. And it is not a joke, and it fits all 3 of them like a coat cut to measure. They were headed nowhere, and they arrived. If you made it to the end of this one, subscribe, because I go deep into the Gilded Age every week, and there are lives here you will not find anywhere else. And tell me something honest in the comments. If a great fortune landed in your lap tomorrow, and you never had to work another day, which of these 3 men do you find the very hardest to forgive? I read every reply,